Drill Sergeant's face went from smug to shocked in 3 seconds flat when I turned around. What he saw on my back wasn't just ink, it was proof that some people aren't who they appear to be. I'm Vivian Chen, but everyone called me Viv. At 19, I was probably the least likely person you'd expect to see in Army basic training. I stood barely 5'2" in my combat boots, weighed about as much as a strong breeze, and looked like I belonged in a library more than a battlefield. My black hair was cropped short for regulation, and my oversized uniform made me look like a kid playing dress-up in her father's clothes. But I wasn't the only character in this story that would surprise people. There was Drill Sergeant Torres, a mountain of a man in his mid-40s with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could shatter glass. He had this way of looking at recruits like he was deciding which ones were worth his time and which ones he could break before lunch. From day one, I fell squarely into the second category. Then there was Colonel Patricia Hawthorne, our base commander. She was in her late 50s, silver-haired, and carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that made grown soldiers stand straighter when she walked by. Most recruits never even saw her during basic training, let alone spoke to her. She was military royalty. The kind of officer who had stories that would never make it into official reports. I grew up in Bend, Oregon, in a house that always smelled like my mom Linda's coffee and my dad Michael's sawdust from whatever construction project he was working on. I had 2 older brothers, Derek and Ryan, who were built like linebackers and treated me like a fragile doll they had to protect. They weren't wrong. I was the family bookworm, the one who preferred reading about military history to actually playing sports. The most important person in shaping who I became was my grandfather, Henry Delacroix. Grandpa Hank lived with us after Grandma died when I was 12. He was quiet, disciplined, and had this way of teaching life lessons without ever raising his voice. What I didn't know then was that he was carrying secrets that would change everything. When I announced I was enlisting right after high school, my family thought I'd lost my mind. My parents were supportive but worried sick. My brothers actually laughed, betting I'd be home within a week, crying about how hard it was. Even my best friend, Autumn, thought I was having some kind of breakdown, but I knew something they didn't. 3 days before I left for Fort Moore, Georgia, I walked into a tattoo parlor and made a decision that would turn my entire world upside down. I got a tattoo that covered most of my upper back. Something significant, something personal, something I'd never shown to another living soul. Not my parents, not my brothers, not even Autumn, who had driven me to the tattoo shop, but waited in the car. I thought that tattoo was just for me, a private tribute to the grandfather who had shaped my character. I had no idea it would become the key to unlocking a story that connected my family to people I'd never met, in ways I never could have imagined. I definitely never expected it would make a drill sergeant who seemed to hate everything about me break down and cry in front of an entire formation. But that's exactly what happened on a sweltering Tuesday morning in Georgia, when 3 weeks of torture finally pushed me to a breaking point I didn't even know I had. Growing up in Bend, Oregon, I was the odd one out in a family of giants. My dad, Michael Chen, stood 6'3" and had hands that could palm a basketball. He'd been swinging hammers and operating heavy machinery since he was 16, and it showed in every calloused finger and sun-weathered line on his face. My mom, Linda, was 5'8" and tough as nails from managing Rosie's Diner downtown for 15 years. She could handle drunk loggers, demanding customers, and a kitchen staff of temperamental cooks without breaking a sweat. Then there were my brothers. Derek was 23 and built like a refrigerator with legs. He worked construction with Dad and could carry a 2x12 on his shoulder like it was a pool noodle. Ryan, 21, was the athletic one who'd gotten a football scholarship to Oregon State before blowing out his knee junior year. Now he worked at the lumber mill and still looked like he could suit up and play tomorrow. And then there was me. 5'2" on a good day, barely cracking 100 pounds soaking wet, with arms so thin that Mom used to joke I looked like I was made of bird bones. While my brothers were outside throwing footballs and chopping wood, I was curled up in the corner of our living room reading everything I could get my hands on. I wasn't just reading romance novels or teen fiction like most girls my age. I devoured military history books, biographies of war heroes, accounts of famous battles. Something about the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in impossible situations fascinated me. My brothers used to tease me about it, calling me their little general and asking if I was planning to conquer the world from my reading chair. The person who understood my fascination was my grandfather, Henry Delacroix. Grandpa Hank had moved in with us when I was 12, right after Grandma Rose passed from cancer. He was Dad's father-in-law, but he'd been more of a father figure to Dad than his own dad ever was. Hank was in his 70s, still straight-backed and sharp-eyed. With silver hair he kept military short and hands that were always steady. He never talked about his time in the service. Ever. We knew he'd been in Vietnam because Mom had mentioned it once, and there were a few old photos in his room of him in uniform looking impossibly young. But if you asked him about it, he'd just change the subject or find something else that suddenly needed his attention. What Hank did teach me was discipline. He'd wake me up at 6 every morning during the summer and take me on long walks through the hills behind our house. He taught me to read maps, to pay attention to my surroundings, to push through discomfort without complaining. He showed me how to stand up straight, how to look people in the eye when I spoke, how to keep my word no matter what it cost me. Character isn't what you do when people are watching, Viv, he'd tell me during those morning walks. It's what you do when nobody would ever know the difference. He also taught me that strength comes in different forms. While Derek and Ryan were bench pressing their way through high school, Grandpa Hank was teaching me mental toughness. He'd make me carry a full backpack on our hikes, not because I needed to get stronger physically, but because I needed to learn that I could do hard things even when my body was telling me to quit. By the time I graduated high school, I felt completely lost. Derek had his construction job with Dad. Ryan had his job at the mill and was talking about maybe going back to school for physical therapy. But me? I had good grades and college acceptance letters, but no idea what I actually wanted to do with my life. The idea of enlisting came to me gradually. It started with those military history books I'd been reading since I was a kid. Then I began watching documentaries about modern military operations, reading accounts of women in combat roles, learning about the opportunities available for people willing to serve. The more I learned, the more I realized this might be exactly what I'd been preparing for without even knowing it. The decision crystallized one evening in March during my senior year. I was sitting at the dinner table listening to Derek complain about his boss and Ryan worry about layoffs at the mill. Both of them seemed stuck, just marking time, waiting for something better that might never come. "I'm going to enlist," I announced, right in the middle of Derek's story about some workplace drama. The table went dead silent. Dad set down his fork. Mom actually dropped her coffee cup and it shattered on the kitchen floor. "Viv, honey," Mom said, kneeling to clean up the mess. "You're barely 100 pounds. The military is for people like Derek and Ryan." "I'm serious," I said, and something in my voice made everyone stop and look at me. "I've been thinking about it for months. I want to serve. I want to do something that matters." Derek laughed, but not in a mean way. "Come on, little sis. You get winded walking up the stairs. Basic training would destroy you." "You'd be miserable," Ryan added. "All that yelling and running and sleeping in the dirt, that's not you." But Grandpa Hank didn't say anything. He just watched me with those sharp eyes of his, and I could see him evaluating something. Finally, he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "If that's what you want to do," Dad said slowly, "your mother and I will support you. But are you sure about this?" I was sure, or at least I thought I was. The next few months were a whirlwind of paperwork, medical exams, and preparation. My parents worried constantly. My brothers oscillated between pride and concern, sometimes in the same conversation. But through it all, Grandpa Hank became my strongest supporter. He started taking me on longer hikes, pushing me harder physically than he ever had before. He taught me basic first aid, how to read military time, how to fold clothes to regulation standards. He never explained how he knew these things, but I was grateful for every lesson. 3 days before I was supposed to leave for Fort Moore, I made a decision that surprised even me. I'd been thinking about Grandpa Hank and everything he'd taught me, about the service he'd never talked about, but that had clearly shaped who he was. I wanted to honor that somehow, to carry it with me. I told my parents I needed to run some errands in town. Instead, I drove to Cascade Tattoo, a shop I'd researched online for weeks. I'd made an appointment, designed exactly what I wanted, and saved up enough money to pay for it without asking my parents for help. The tattoo took 4 hours. It covered most of my upper back, from my shoulders to just above my lower ribs. It was a military memorial piece, a battlefield cross with combat boots, dog tags, and a helmet. But it wasn't generic. Every detail was specific, personal, meaningful. The artist, a guy named Jake who was a veteran himself, kept asking if I was sure about the size and placement. "This is going to be visible in a lot of situations," he warned. "Military, sports, formal events. You sure you want something this big?" I was sure. This tattoo was going to be my reminder of everything Grandpa Hank had taught me. Everything. I wanted to become. It was going to be my strength when I felt weak, my motivation when I wanted to quit. I just had no idea it was going to be so much more than that. When I got home that night, Grandpa Hank was sitting on the porch waiting for me. "How was your errand?" he asked, and something in his tone told me he knew exactly what I'd been doing. "Good," I said. "I think you'd approve." He studied my face in the porch light, then nodded. "I'm sure I would." 2 days later, he drove me to the airport. He didn't say much during the car ride, but just before I got out, he grabbed my hand. "Remember what I taught you about character, Viv. And remember that sometimes the strongest people are the ones carrying the heaviest loads, even when nobody can see the weight." I hugged him goodbye, shouldered my duffel bag, and walked into the airport thinking I was ready for anything basic training could throw at me. I was wrong about that. But I was about to discover that sometimes being wrong about your own strength is the first step to finding out who you really are. The bus ride to Fort Moore, Georgia felt like being transported to another planet. I'd never been further south than Sacramento, and the humidity hit me like a wet blanket the moment I stepped off that Greyhound. The base itself looked exactly like every military movie I'd ever watched. Endless rows of identical buildings, perfectly manicured lawns, and flags snapping in the breeze under a sun that felt close enough to touch. Processing was a blur of paperwork, medical checks, and uniform fittings. They gave me everything in extra small, and it still hung on me like I was playing dress-up in my dad's closet. The other recruits looked like they belonged there. There was this girl from Texas, named Brooklyn, who looked like she could wrestle a bull, and a guy from Detroit called Marcus who had arms bigger than my waist. Then there was me, drowning in army green and trying to pretend I wasn't terrified. My first real glimpse of what I was in for came during the initial formation when we met our drill sergeant. Drill Sergeant Torres looked like he'd been carved out of granite and then given a voice that could wake the dead. He was probably 6'4", built like a linebacker, with dark eyes that seemed to catalog every weakness you had just by looking at you. He walked down our ragged line of new recruits like a general inspecting troops, stopping occasionally to bark corrections at someone's posture or uniform. When he got to me, he stopped completely. "What's your name, soldier?" "Vivian Chen, Drill Sergeant." He looked me up and down, taking in my 5'2" frame and the way my uniform practically swallowed me whole. Well, looks like they're sending us mice now instead of soldiers." "That what you are, Chen? A little mouse?" "No, Drill Sergeant. I think you are. Matter of fact, that's what I'm going to call you. Mouse. Because that's what you look like, squeaking around here in that oversized uniform." A few recruits behind me snickered, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment. But I kept my mouth shut and my eyes forward, just like Grandpa Hank had taught me. That was day one. It only got worse from there. Torres seemed to have made it his personal mission to break me. During morning PT, he'd make me do exercises until I collapsed while the rest of the platoon watched. During meals, he'd time how long it took me to eat and then make me do push-ups if I wasn't fast enough. During equipment checks, he'd find fault with everything I did, even when my bunk and gear were identical to everyone else's. "Mouse thinks she can play soldier," he'd announced to the entire formation. "Mouse can't even carry her own pack without stumbling around like a drunk toddler." The pack comment stung because it was partially true. My rucksack, loaded with standard gear, weighed nearly a quarter of my body weight. During our first long march, I fell behind within the first mile, struggling under the weight, while Torres jogged alongside me, shouting encouragement like, "Come on, Mouse. Your enemies aren't going to wait for you to catch your breath." The other recruits learned quickly that being associated with me was social suicide. Torres had a talent for collective punishment, and if I screwed up, everyone paid for it. After the third time my failures resulted in the entire platoon doing extra push-ups, I found myself completely isolated. Breakfast became a lonely affair of sitting at the end of a table while conversations died whenever I approached. During free time, I'd lie on my bunk reading letters from home while everyone else socialized. Even simple things like asking to borrow soap or a pen became awkward interactions where people would help me but clearly didn't want to be seen doing it. Chakir, physical challenges were brutal, but the isolation was worse. I'd call home once a week using the payphone, and Mom would ask how I was making friends. I'd lie and tell her everything was fine, that the other recruits were great, that I was learning so much. The truth was, I was more alone than I'd ever been in my life. Torres's favorite torture was the obstacle course. It was a series of walls to climb, ropes to navigate, and barriers to crawl under, all designed to test strength, agility, and determination. For someone my size, it might as well have been Mount Everest. The rope climb was my personal nightmare. It was 20 feet of thick manila rope that you had to ascend using only your arms and legs. No gear, no assistance. Most of the guys could muscle their way up through pure upper body strength. The women who succeeded usually had some combination of technique and determination that I couldn't seem to master. Day after day, I'd stand at the bottom of that rope, jump up to grab it, and make it maybe 6 feet before my arms gave out, and I'd slide back down, rope burn decorating my palms like badges of failure. "Mouse can't even climb a rope," Torres would announce to anyone within earshot. "In combat, soldiers like Mouse get real heroes killed because someone has to stop and help her sorry behind instead of completing the mission." That comment hit harder than all the physical punishment combined. The idea that my weakness could get someone else hurt or killed wasn't something I'd considered when I enlisted. I'd been thinking about serving my country, about honor and duty and making a difference. I hadn't thought about being a liability. The breaking point came during week 3, on a Tuesday that started like any other. We'd done morning PT, which involved me collapsing during sit-ups while Torres made disparaging comments about my core strength. We'd had breakfast, where I sat alone picking at eggs that tasted like cardboard while listening to other recruits plan weekend activities I wouldn't be invited to join. Then came the afternoon obstacle course session, and something about Torres's mood seemed particularly vicious. Maybe he'd had a bad phone call from home, or maybe command was pressuring him about our platoon's performance metrics. Whatever it was, he decided to make me the focus of his frustration. "Mouse," he barked as we assembled at the course. "Since you failed to complete this course successfully even once in 3 weeks, you're going to demonstrate for everyone how not to do it." The other recruits formed a semicircle around the rope climb. I could feel their eyes on me, some sympathetic, others impatient, a few openly amused. This was entertainment for them now, watching the smallest, weakest recruit fail spectacularly while their drill sergeant provided color commentary. I approached the rope with as much dignity as I could muster. My hands were already sweating, and I hadn't even touched the thing yet. I jumped up, grabbed the rope, and started to climb. 3 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet. My arms were burning, but I kept going, determined not to give Torres fresh ammunition. 10 feet, 12 feet. Then my grip failed. I slid down that rope so fast that I hit the ground hard, landing awkwardly on my right ankle. Pain shot up my leg, and I bit back a cry. Torres was there immediately, standing over me like a predator over wounded prey. "Pathetic," he spat. "Absolutely pathetic. This is what happens when we lower standards. This is what happens when we pretend that wanting something is the same as being capable of earning it." I struggled to my feet, testing my ankle. It hurt, but it would hold me. What hurt? Worse was the look of disgust on Torres's face and the uncomfortable silence from my fellow recruits. "You know what, Mouse?" Torres continued, his voice carrying across the entire training area. "I've been trying to help you for 3 weeks, trying to turn you into something resembling a soldier. But maybe it's time to accept reality. Maybe it's time for you to call Mommy and Daddy and tell them this was all a big mistake. Something inside me snapped, not in an angry way, but in a clarifying way. I thought about Grandpa Hank and all those morning walks, all those lessons about character and pushing through discomfort. I thought about the way he'd looked at me when I told him I was enlisting, the pride in his eyes when he'd driven me to the airport. "I'm not quitting, Drill Sergeant," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Torres stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. "What did you say, Mouse?" I said, "I'm not quitting, Drill Sergeant. You can make me do this rope climb 100 times and I'll fail 99 of them. But I'm not going home." For a moment, something flickered across Torres's face. Surprise, maybe, or possibly a hint of respect. But it was gone quickly, replaced by his usual scowl. "We'll see about that, Mouse. We'll just see about that." That night, my bunkmate, Kendra Walsh, found me in the latrine at 2 a.m. Kendra was from Detroit, tough as nails, and one of the few recruits who didn't actively avoid me, though she'd never gone out of her way to be friendly either. I was sitting on the floor, my back against the wall, trying not to cry. My ankle was throbbing, my palms were raw from rope burn, and I felt more defeated than I ever had in my life. "You okay, Chen?" Kendra asked, settling down beside me. "I'm fine," I lied. "No, you're not. Nobody sits in a latrine at 2 in the morning because they're fine." I looked at her, this girl who'd grown up in one of the toughest cities in America, who'd probably seen more hardship in her 19 years than I'd see in a lifetime. What could I possibly say to her about my problems that wouldn't sound like privileged whining? "Torres is trying to break you," she said matter-of-factly. "Question is, are you going to let him? I don't know how to stop him." Kendra studied me for a long moment. "Look, Chen, I don't pretend to know your story, but I know you're hiding something. The way you change clothes, the way you shower, you're careful about your back in a way. That tells me there's something there you don't want people to see." My heart started racing. I'd been so careful, always turning away when I changed, always showering in the corner stall when fewer people were around. "I don't know what it is," Kendra continued, "but maybe it's time to stop hiding. Maybe whatever you're protecting is exactly what you need to show Torres he's wrong about you. What if it makes things worse? Chen, things are already as bad as they can get. Torres has made you the platoon punching bag. Half the recruits think you're going to wash out, and you're sitting in a latrine crying at 2 in the morning. How exactly could it get worse?" She had a point. I'd spent 3 weeks trying to blend in, trying to meet everyone else's expectations of what a soldier should look like. But maybe blending in wasn't the answer. Maybe it was time to show them exactly who Vivian Chen really was. The tattoo on my back wasn't just ink and artwork. It was my connection to everything Grandpa Hank had taught me about service, sacrifice, and character. It was my reminder that strength comes in different forms, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is carry someone else's story with honor. Maybe Kendra was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. I didn't sleep at all after my conversation with Kendra. I lay on my narrow bunk staring at the ceiling while the rest of the platoon snored around me, thinking about what she'd said. The tattoo on my back felt like it was burning through my skin, demanding attention I'd been too afraid to give it. By the time Reveille sounded at 500, I'd made my decision. Whatever happened today, I wasn't going to keep hiding who I was. I'd spent 3 weeks trying to be invisible, trying to meet everyone else's definition of what a soldier should look like. It had gotten me nothing but isolation, humiliation, and Torres treating me like I was less than human. Morning PT started the same as always. We assembled in formation while Torres walked among us, looking for uniform violations or signs of weakness. The Georgia sun was already brutal at 6 in the morning, promising another day of sweltering heat that would drain what little energy I had. "Today we're going to see who's been taking PT seriously and who's been coasting," Torres announced to the formation. "We're starting with push-ups. Real push-ups, not the pathetic attempts at exercise some of you have been passing off as military standard." He walked directly to me, stopping so close I could see the sweat stains on his uniform from his pre-dawn workout. "Mouse, you're going to demonstrate proper push-up form for the platoon. Drop and give me 20, and don't even think about letting those knees touch the ground. This was classic Torres. Make me perform in front of everyone knowing I'd struggle, knowing it would reinforce his narrative about my weakness. I dropped into position, hands shoulder-width apart, body straight from head to heels. The first 10 push-ups were manageable. I'd been working on upper body strength since arriving, and while I wasn't strong, I wasn't completely helpless either. But by number 15, my arms were shaking. By 18, I was fighting just to maintain form. Pathetic form, Mouse, Torres barked. Your back is sagging like a broken bridge. How do you expect to carry a wounded soldier if you can't even carry yourself? Push-up 19 was agony. My arms felt like they were made of jelly, and sweat was dripping into my eyes, stinging and blurring my vision. But I managed it. Push-up 20 broke me. My arms collapsed and I crashed face first into the dirt, getting a mouthful of Georgia clay for my efforts. Finished already? Torres's voice dripped with mock disappointment. Well, that was educational for everyone. This is what happens when physical standards get lowered to accommodate people who have no business wearing the uniform. I struggled to my knees, spitting dirt and wiping sweat from my eyes. The entire platoon was watching, some with sympathy, others with embarrassment on my behalf, a few with barely concealed amusement. Stand up, Mouse. Turn around so everyone can see the face of failure. This was the moment. Everything in my training so far had led to this instant where I could either continue to be Torres's victim or make a choice that would change everything. As I slowly got to my feet, still on my knees, I felt the weight of every lesson Grandpa Hank had taught me. Character isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when nobody would know the difference. But sometimes character is exactly what you do when everyone is watching, when the stakes are highest, when you have the most to lose. Torres was still talking, something about standards and weakness and how I was everything wrong with the modern military. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about the tattoo on my back, about the stories it told, about the men who'd died so far from home that their families might never know exactly how brave they'd been. Turn around, Mouse. Let everyone see. My name is Vivian Chen, I said, cutting him off. My voice was quiet, but something in my tone made the entire formation go silent. Not Mouse, Vivian Chen. Torres stopped mid-sentence, clearly not used to being interrupted. What did you say? I stood up slowly, deliberately. My uniform was soaked with sweat, and I could feel the fabric clinging to my back. This was it. The, point of no return. I said my name is Vivian Chen, Drill Sergeant, and I'm tired of hiding who I am to make everyone else comfortable. You're out of line, soldier. Maybe I am, I replied, reaching for the bottom of my PT shirt. But I'm done being ashamed of where I come from and what I represent. Torres's eyes went wide as he realized what I was about to do. Chen, don't. But I was already pulling my shirt up and over my head, turning my back to him and the entire formation. The morning air hit my skin, and I heard several sharp intakes of breath from the recruits behind me. The tattoo covered my entire upper back, from my shoulders to just above the small of my back. It wasn't some generic military design or a pretty butterfly that college girls get on spring break. This was a battlefield memorial, rendered in stunning detail by an artist who understood exactly what it meant. The centerpiece was a battlefield cross, an M16 rifle thrust bayonet first into the ground, topped with a combat helmet and flanked by combat boots. Dog tags hung from the rifle's grip, and the entire image was surrounded by poppies and an American flag that seemed to wave even though it was permanently inked into my skin. But what made Torres's face go white weren't the standard military symbols. It was the specific details that only someone with intimate knowledge would recognize. The dog tags weren't generic. They bore real names, real service numbers, real blood types. Around the central image were unit patches, call signs, and coordinates. That meant something specific to people who'd been there. At the bottom, in flowing script, were the words Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 10th Mountain Division, and dates from 2018. Along the edges of the design were smaller details, inside jokes written in barely legible script, nicknames that would mean nothing to most people, small symbols that told stories about brotherhood and sacrifice that most people would never understand. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could hear my own heartbeat. Could feel the eyes of 30-plus recruits boring into my back. Could sense Torres struggling to process what he was seeing. "Where did you get those names?" His voice was barely a whisper. And when I turned around, to face him I saw something I'd never seen before, tears forming in his eyes. "They're my grandfather's squad," I said, pulling my shirt back on. "Henry Delacroix. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 10th Mountain Division before shrapnel. From an IED ended his career and nearly ended his life." Torres just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. "He never talked about his service," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Never told war stories, never bragged about his medals, never even admitted he had nightmares sometimes. But after he died last year, I found his journals. 3 composition notebooks hidden in his bedroom closet, filled with stories about the men he served with. I could see recognition dawning on Torres's face, could see him putting pieces together that I didn't even know existed. He wrote about Sergeant Martinez, who taught him how to read Arabic so they could better communicate with locals. He wrote about Corporal Thompson, who could fix anything with duct tape and determination. He wrote about Private Jackson, who was only 18 when they lost him to a roadside bomb. Torres's hands were actually shaking now. The tough-as-nails drill sergeant who'd spent 3 weeks breaking me down was falling apart in front of the entire formation. He wrote about a day in September 2018 when their convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar. I said, taking a step closer to Torres. He wrote about pulling wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee while taking enemy fire. He wrote about carrying a kid named Tommy 2 miles through hostile territory to reach the extraction point. "Jackson," Torres whispered. "Tommy Jackson was my little brother." The words hit the formation like a physical blow. Several recruits actually stepped back, and I heard someone gasp. Torres was crying openly now, tears streaming down his face as he stared at me like I was a ghost. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice breaking. "Henry Delacroix. He saved my life. He pulled me out of that Humvee when the IED went off, carried me and Tommy to safety, while shrapnel was flying everywhere." The entire dynamic shifted in that moment. Torres wasn't looking at Mouse anymore. He was looking at the granddaughter of the man who'd saved his life and tried to save his brothers. "He never made it home, did he?" Torres asked. "Tommy, your grandfather wrote about carrying him, but Tommy didn't make it. The journals say he died in your grandfather's arms during the helicopter ride to the field hospital," I replied. "Grandpa Hank held him the whole way, told him he was going to be okay, even when they both knew he wasn't." Torres buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The formation stood frozen, unsure how to process what they were witnessing. This was their drill sergeant, the man who'd been tearing us down for weeks, completely undone by a story about a day that had happened thousands of miles away and years in the past. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red but clear. "Your grandfather never got the recognition he deserved for that day. The paperwork got lost, the witnesses were scattered to different units, and by the time anyone tried to sort it out, everyone had moved on." "He never mentioned it," I said. "I only learned about any of this from his journals." "He saved 4 soldiers that day, including me. He should have gotten the Silver Star minimum, maybe the Distinguished Service Cross." Torres wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to regain some composure. "And his granddaughter has been in my formation for 3 weeks while I've been treating her like garbage." The silence that followed was deafening. 30-plus recruits who'd watched me get humiliated daily were now staring at me with new eyes. I wasn't just the weak kid who couldn't climb a rope anymore. I was connected to something bigger, something that had shaped their drill sergeant in ways none of us had understood. "Why didn't you tell me?" Torres asked. "You never asked who I was," I replied. "You decided I was Mouse on day 1 and never bothered to learn anything else." He nodded slowly, accepting the truth of that statement. "You're right. I saw what I wanted to see, made assumptions based on your size and my own prejudices." He straightened up, some of his military bearing returning. "That changes now. Drill sergeant, your grandfather earned respect through his actions specialist, Chen. It's about time his granddaughter received the same courtesy. It was the first time he'd used my real name." The transformation in Torres was immediate and complete, but it wasn't just about guilt or even gratitude. As he stood there wiping tears from his eyes in front of the entire formation, something fundamental had shifted. He wasn't looking at me as the weak link in his platoon anymore. He was seeing Henry Delacroix's granddaughter, and that meant everything. Formation, dismissed for morning chow. Torres commanded, his voice still rough with emotion. Chen, you stay behind. The other recruits dispersed quickly, probably eager to process what they'd just witnessed. Kendra caught my eye as she passed and gave me the smallest nod of approval. Brooklyn, the tough girl from Texas who'd never spoken to me before, actually squeezed my shoulder as she walked by. When we were alone on the PT field, Torres sat down heavily on a wooden bench that faced the obstacle course. He gestured for me to join him. Tell me about your grandfather, he said. Not the soldier, the man. What was he like? I settled beside him, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. He was quiet, the kind of person who taught through example rather than lectures. He never raised his voice, never complained about anything, never asked for help even when he clearly needed it. Torres nodded. That sounds like the Henry Delacroix I knew, always first to volunteer for the dangerous missions, always last to take credit for anything. After my grandmother died, he moved in with us. He'd wake me up every morning at 6 and take me on these long walks through the hills behind our house. He taught me to read maps, to pay attention to details, to push through discomfort without whining about it. Did he ever mention Afghanistan? Any of us? I shook my head. Never. I found 3 journals hidden in his closet after he passed last year. That's the only reason I know anything about his service. He wrote about all of you like you were family. Torres was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the obstacle course where I'd failed so many times over the past 3 weeks. September 15th, 2018, he said finally. We were returning from a routine patrol when the convoy hit 2 IEDs simultaneously. The lead vehicle was destroyed instantly. 3 KIA, no survivors. Our Humvee flipped and caught fire. He paused, lost in a memory that was clearly still vivid after all these years. I was trapped under twisted metal, probably had a concussion, definitely had broken ribs. Your grandfather was in the vehicle behind us. Protocol was to secure the area and wait for EOD to clear any additional explosives before attempting rescue. But Henry Delacroix didn't follow protocol that day. Torres turned to look at me directly. He ran through active enemy fire to reach our burning vehicle. Pulled me out first because I was closest to the door, then went back for my brother. Tommy was trapped worse than I was, metal pinning his legs, unconscious, bleeding badly. The weight of what my grandfather had done was starting to sink in. I'd known he was a veteran, known he'd served with distinction, but I'd never understood the specific heroism he'd shown. It took your grandfather 20 minutes to free Tommy from that wreckage while taking sporadic enemy fire. 20 minutes of refusing to leave a wounded soldier behind, even when everyone else was telling him it was too dangerous. When he finally got Tommy out, both of them were covered in blood. Torres's voice broke slightly. Then the extraction helicopter couldn't land at our position because of continued enemy activity. Your grandfather carried my brother, carried a 160-pound man, 2 miles through hostile territory to reach the landing zone. I thought about all those morning walks, about Grandpa Hank teaching me to push through discomfort, about his quiet lessons on character and determination. He'd been preparing me for challenges I couldn't even imagine, drawing from experiences he'd never shared. Tommy was conscious during part of the helicopter ride, Torres continued. The medics were working on him, but it was clear he wasn't going to make it. Your grandfather held his hand the whole time, told him he was brave, told him his family would be proud. The image of my quiet, reserved grandfather comforting a dying young soldier was almost too much to process. This was the same man who'd taught me to tie my shoes, who'd helped me with homework, who'd sat patiently through countless bedtime stories. Tommy died holding your grandfather's hand, Torres said. His last words were asking Henry to tell me he was sorry he wouldn't be at my wedding. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the weight of that story. Finally, Torres stood up and walked to his truck, returning with a worn manila folder. I've been carrying this for 6 years, he said, opening the folder. to reveal military paperwork, witness statements, and photographs. Your grandfather should have received the Silver Star for his actions that day minimum. Maybe the Distinguished Service Cross, but the paperwork got lost in the shuffle. Witnesses were reassigned, and by the time anyone tried to follow up, it was ancient history. He pulled out a black and white photograph of a group of soldiers in combat gear standing in front of a forward operating base. Even in the grainy image, I could recognize Grandpa Hank, younger, leaner, but with the same steady eyes and quiet confidence. "That's Bravo Company taken 2 weeks before the IED incident," Torres said, pointing to my grandfather. "Your grandfather is right there next to Tommy. They looked out for each other like brothers." I studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the young soldier in the image with the grandfather who'd raised me. He looked so serious, so focused, carrying responsibilities I was only beginning to understand. "There's something else?" Torres said, pulling out a small wooden box. "This belongs to you." Inside the box was a Purple Heart medal, still in its original case, along with a folded letter written on official military stationery. "Your grandfather was wounded in that IED attack too," Torres explained. "Shrapnel in his left shoulder, burns on his hands and arms from pulling us out of the burning vehicle. He earned this medal, but like everything else, the paperwork got tangled up in military bureaucracy." I held the medal carefully, feeling the weight of my grandfather's sacrifice in my hands. The letter was addressed to Henry Delacroix, thanking him for his service and explaining that his Purple Heart would be forwarded once his unit processed the necessary documentation. He never received this? Not officially. The military moves, slowly sometimes, especially when units are being reorganized and personnel are scattered. Your grandfather was medically discharged while the paperwork was still being processed, and somehow it just fell through the cracks. Torres closed the folder and looked at me seriously. "I've spent the last 6 years trying to track down everyone who served with your grandfather, collecting witness statements, filing appeals with the Military Personnel Records Office. I wanted to make sure he got the recognition he deserved. Why? Because Tommy was my baby brother, and Henry Delacroix gave him a dignified death. Because your grandfather saved my life and asked for nothing in return. Because some debts can never be repaid, but they should never be forgotten." He stood up and extended his hand to help me up from the bench. "And because his granddaughter has been in my formation for 3 weeks while I've been treating her like she doesn't belong here." The walk back toward the barracks felt different. Torres wasn't the intimidating drill sergeant who'd made my life miserable. He was a man processing the discovery that one of his recruits was connected to the most important day of his military career. "Chen," he said as we approached the mess hall where the rest of the platoon was eating breakfast. "Yes, drill sergeant." "Your grandfather never told you he was a hero, did he?" I shook my head. "He never told me anything about his service. I learned about all of this from his journals after he died." Torres nodded, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. That's exactly the kind of man he was. Real heroes don't need to advertise their heroism. He paused at the entrance to the mess hall, where we could hear the normal sounds of soldiers eating and talking. "What you did back there, showing that tattoo, standing up for yourself, that took courage. Different kind of courage than what your grandfather showed in Afghanistan, but courage nonetheless." It didn't feel courageous. It felt desperate. Sometimes that's the same thing. Sometimes you have to get desperate enough to show people who you really are. He opened the door and gestured for me to enter first. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." As I walked into the mess hall, conversations gradually stopped. Word had clearly spread about what had happened during PT, and everyone was staring at me with curiosity, respect, or some combination of both. But for the first time, since arriving at Fort Moore, I didn't feel like I was drowning in my oversized uniform. I felt like I was wearing it, like I belonged in it. Kendra waved me over to her table, where she'd saved a seat. "So," she said as I sat down with my tray of eggs and toast, "that was some serious drama on the PT field this morning." "Yeah, it, was. You okay?" I thought about the question as I looked around the mess hall. Torres was at the drill sergeant table, but he kept glancing over at me. not with the predatory attention he'd shown before, but with something that looked almost protective. The other recruits were still staring, but the atmosphere felt different. Less like I was a curiosity and more like I was a person with a story worth hearing. "Yeah," I said, taking a bite of toast. "I think I'm going to be okay." What I didn't know yet was that the story was far from over. What I'd revealed about my grandfather was about to set in motion events that would change not just my basic training experience, but my entire military career. Torres had work to do, phone calls to make, and a promise to keep to a soldier who'd died in his arms 6 years earlier. My grandfather's story was finally going to get the ending it deserved. The change in Torres was immediate, but the change in everyone else took time to unfold. That first day after the revelation, the other recruits didn't quite know how to treat me. I wasn't Mouse anymore, but I wasn't exactly one of them yet either. I existed in this strange limbo where people would nod respectfully when they passed me, but still weren't sure how to start a conversation. Kendra was different. That afternoon, she found me sitting alone outside the barracks, writing a letter to my parents. "So your grandfather was basically Captain America," she said, settling down beside me on the concrete steps. "He was just doing his job. Chen, my dad served 2 tours in Iraq. Trust me, pulling people out of burning vehicles while taking enemy fire is not just doing your job. That's hero-level stuff." I looked at her, this tough girl from Detroit who'd grown up surrounded by violence and hardship, and realized she understood something about my grandfather that I was still processing. "The crazy part is he never told me," I said. "I lived with him for 7 years, and he never once mentioned Afghanistan or any of the people he served with. Maybe he was protecting you from it. Some veterans don't want to share that weight with their families." That evening, Torres pulled me aside after dinner. His entire demeanor had transformed. Where there had been barely concealed contempt, now there was something approaching reverence. "Chen, I made some phone calls today. Reached out to some people in the personnel office, called in a few favors, with guys I served with who are now in administrative positions." "About what, drill sergeant?" "About getting your grandfather the recognition he should have received 6 years ago. It's not going to be easy. Military bureaucracy moves like molasses uphill. But I think I can make it happen." The idea that Grandpa Hank might finally receive official recognition for his service felt surreal. He'd been gone for almost a year, and I'd spent most of that time thinking he was just a quiet old man who'd served his country without distinction. "There's something else," Torres continued. "I reached out to Colonel Hawthorne, explained the situation. She wants to meet with you." Colonel Patricia Hawthorne was base royalty, a career officer with 30 years of service who commanded respect from everyone who wore the uniform. Most recruits never even saw her during basic training, let alone had personal meetings with her. "What does she want to talk about?" "Your future in the Army, I imagine. Your grandfather's story, maybe. Colonel Hawthorne has a reputation for taking care of soldiers with distinguished family histories." The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday, which gave me a full week to stress about it. But that week turned out to be the best 7 days I'd had since arriving at Fort Moore. Torres didn't completely stop being a drill sergeant. He still yelled, still demanded perfection, still made us do push-ups when someone screwed up. But the viciousness was gone, replaced by something that felt more like tough love than outright hostility. More importantly, he started treating me like I belonged there. When I struggled with the rope climb, instead of mocking my weakness, he stayed, after hours to work on my technique. When I fell behind during long marches, he'd jog alongside me, offering encouragement instead of insults. "Your grandfather didn't quit when things got tough," he'd say during those moments when I wanted to give up. He carried a wounded soldier. 2 miles through enemy territory, you can make it another quarter mile. The other recruits noticed the change and began following Torres's lead. Brooklyn started inviting me to study sessions where we'd quiz each other on military knowledge. Marcus, the big guy from Detroit, began including me in conversations about home and family. Even the recruits who'd been openly amused by my failures started offering tips on technique and encouragement during difficult exercises. The rope climb remained my nemesis, but now, instead of being an object of ridicule, it became a shared challenge. Other recruits would cheer when I made progress, offer advice when I struggled, and celebrate small victories like making it halfway up without falling. By the end of that week, I finally did it. Not gracefully, not easily, but I climbed that 20-foot rope from bottom to top without letting go. When I rang the bell at the top and slid back down, Torres was waiting with something I'd never seen from him before. A genuine smile. Outstanding, Chen. Your grandfather would be proud. Friday afternoon arrived with typical Georgia humidity and my nerves stretched tight as piano wire. I'd pressed my uniform until it was crisp enough to cut glass and polished my boots until they reflected like mirrors. Torres walked with me to the headquarters building, which somehow made the whole thing feel even more significant. Colonel Hawthorne's office was intimidating in the way that military spaces often are. Flags, commendations, photographs of her with various dignitaries and fellow officers spanning decades of service. She was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 5'6", but she carried herself with the kind of authority that filled a room. Specialist Chen, she said, standing to shake my hand. Please, have a seat. Torres remained at attention until she gestured for him to sit as well. The formality of it all made me even more nervous. Drill Sergeant Torres has told me about your grandfather and his service with the 10th Mountain Division. I've spent the last week reviewing military records and speaking with personnel who were involved in the incident. She opened a thick file folder on her desk and pulled out several documents. Your grandfather's actions on September 15, 2018 were extraordinary by any standard. He saved 4 American lives while putting his own at significant risk, and he did it without regard for proper protocol or his own safety. Yes, ma'am. What's remarkable is that he never sought recognition for those actions. Most soldiers would have pushed for proper documentation, made sure their heroism was officially recorded. Your grandfather simply returned to duty and continued serving until his medical discharge. She turned to a page covered with official military letterhead and signatures. I'm pleased to inform you that the Department of the Army has approved your grandfather's Silver Star, effective immediately. The paperwork that was lost 6 years ago has been reconstructed based on witness testimony and after-action reports. The words hit me like a physical blow. Silver Star, one of the highest decorations for valor in the American military. My quiet grandfather, who'd never talked about his service, had earned one of the most prestigious awards a soldier could receive. Additionally, Colonel Hawthorne continued, I've arranged for a formal presentation ceremony. Your grandfather's Silver Star will be presented to your family, with full military honors, at a ceremony here on base. I felt tears starting to form and tried to blink them back. My family? I spoke with your parents yesterday. They'll be flying out next weekend, along with your brothers. Your grandfather will receive the recognition he earned, even if it's 6 years too late. Torres was smiling broadly, clearly proud of whatever role he'd played in making this happen. There's one more thing, Colonel Hawthorne said. Your grandfather's story and your own actions during basic training have caught the attention of some people in the Leadership Development Program. We'd like to discuss accelerated advancement opportunities once you complete basic training, ma'am. Officers who understand sacrifice, who come from families with distinguished service records, who show character under pressure. Those are the leaders the Army needs. Your grandfather's legacy combined with your own potential makes for an interesting combination. The ceremony took place the following Saturday. My parents flew in from Oregon looking simultaneously proud and overwhelmed. Mom kept hugging me and telling me how much I looked like Grandpa Hank in uniform. Dad was quieter, but I could see the emotion in his eyes when he looked at the Silver Star. Derek and Ryan were different than I'd expected. Instead of the teasing brothers who'd bet I'd quit within a week, they treated me with something approaching. Derek actually asked for my autograph, joking that he wanted it before I became famous. You know, Ryan said during the reception after the ceremony, Grandpa Hank always said you were special. We thought he just meant book smart, but I think he saw something else. The ceremony itself was beautiful and heartbreaking. Colonel Hawthorne read the citation aloud, detailing Grandpa Hank's actions that day in Afghanistan. Torres stood at attention nearby, tears streaming down his face as she described how my grandfather had saved his life and tried to save his brothers. When they presented the Silver Star to Mom, representing the family, the entire assembled formation saluted. It was a moment of recognition that should have happened 6 years earlier, but somehow felt perfect happening now. After the ceremony, Torres approached my family. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that your father-in-law saved my life. If it weren't for Henry Delacroix, I wouldn't be here today to serve as your daughter's drill sergeant." Mom started crying again, and Dad shook Torres's hand for a long time without saying anything. "Your daughter has his courage," Torres continued. "She's going to make an outstanding soldier and an even better officer when the time comes." The weeks that followed passed quickly. My performance in basic training improved dramatically, not because I'd gotten physically stronger overnight, but because I'd finally understood what I was there to do. I wasn't trying to prove I belonged anymore. I knew I belonged. The question was how much I could accomplish. I graduated second in my class, which shocked everyone except Torres, who claimed he'd seen it coming from the moment I'd shown him my tattoo. The award ceremony felt surreal, receiving commendations and recognition after spending the first 3 weeks as the platoon punching bag. But the most meaningful moment came when Torres pulled me aside after graduation. "Chen, I owe you an apology. I spent 3 weeks trying to break you because I saw what I wanted to see instead of who you actually were. You don't owe me anything, drill sergeant. You helped me become stronger." "No, that's not right. You were always strong. You just had to learn how to show it. Your grandfather didn't make you tough. He helped you discover the toughness that was already there." He handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a photograph of Grandpa Hank's unit taken just days before the IED attack. On the back, someone had written all their names and a short message. "For Viv, these are the men your grandfather saved. Thank you for making sure their stories are remembered." 5 years later, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned to my first command. The letter requesting my transfer came from an unexpected source, Drill Sergeant Torres, who was now Sergeant Major Torres and needed junior officers for his new battalion. "I've been watching your career," he said when I reported for duty. "Your grandfather would be proud of the officer you've become." "Actually," I said, "I think he'd be proud of the people you helped me learn to lead." The tattoo on my back had evolved over the years. I'd added small details, dates, names, symbols, representing my own service and the soldiers I'd led. But the core remained the same, a tribute to my grandfather and the men he'd served with. Sometimes people ask me about it when they see it at the gym or during medical examinations. I tell them it's a reminder that strength comes in different forms, that the most powerful people are often the ones carrying invisible burdens, and that sometimes the smallest person in the room might be standing on the shoulders of giants. I never did tell them about those first 3 weeks at Fort Moore when everyone called me Mouse, and I felt like I was drowning in a uniform that was too big for me. But I remember it every time I meet a new soldier who looks lost or overwhelmed, or convinced they don't belong. "Character isn't what you do when people are watching," I tell them, repeating my grandfather's words. "It's what you do when nobody would know the difference." But sometimes, just sometimes, character is exactly what you show the world when you're tired of hiding who you really are. The girl they called Mouse is now Major Vivian Chen, and the lessons I learned from a drill sergeant who almost broke me have shaped every decision I've made since. Because sometimes the people who challenge us the most are the ones who end up believing in us the strongest. And sometimes a tattoo isn't just decoration. It's a roadmap back to the strength you never knew you had.